8 years married to a man who still can't afford a decent shirt.
Is that the one from the hardware store clearance rack?
Miles, come here. Let everyone see what I've been dealing with.
Natalie, don't.
This is exactly what our marriage looks like. Old, worn out, and falling apart. Sign the papers tonight, or I do this again.
That was the moment my wife chose. Not behind closed doors, not in a lawyer's office, but in front of 400 people under the lights of the Lucent Assembly, with her lover watching and the whole room laughing. She grabbed my father's shirt and tore it open like it was nothing, because to her, that was exactly what it was. What Natalie did not know, what no one in that room knew, was that earlier that same morning, everything had changed. And now I had a decision to make about how I would let this night end. If stories like this stay with you, stories about what people reveal when they think you have nothing, this channel is where they live. Subscribe and don't miss what comes next. I have been asked more than once what it feels like to stand in a room full of people and realize that the woman you married has been performing a version of your life that you never agreed to live. The honest answer is that it does not feel like anything at first. It feels like nothing, the way a burn takes a full second before the pain arrives, before your body catches up to what just happened and decides how badly it needs to react. The shirt had belonged to my father. He gave it to me the week before he died, when I was 31 and still sleeping on a cot in a converted garage, because every dollar I had went directly into research. It was not an expensive shirt. He had bought it from a department store during a clearance sale, the kind of place he always preferred, because he believed you should spend money on what lasts, not on what impresses other people. When he handed it to me, folded and still in the paper bag from the store, he said he hoped I would wear it the day something I built finally worked the way I always said it would. I wore it the morning I filed the first patent for Kestrel Axis Technologies. I wore it again the night of the Ravenport Revitalization Gala, which is either a meaningful coincidence or a reminder that I was never quite as strategic as the people around me assumed. Natalie and I had been married for 8 years by the time we arrived at the Lucent Assembly. When we first met, she had found my focus admirable. She told me once early on that she loved how certain I was about what I was building, even when no one else could see it yet. In those early years, we ate cheap food at a second-hand table we found on a neighbor's curb, and she would sit across from me while I sketched diagrams on paper napkins, and she would ask questions and actually listen to the answers. I used to believe that version of her was the real one, and that everything which came later was something the world had done to her gradually, the way environments can reshape people without their full awareness. It took me a long time to accept that people do not change as much as they reveal themselves, and that what I had mistaken for transformation was simply patience running out. The work consumed most of what I had to give. Kestrel Axis was built around a thermal regulation system I had been developing since graduate school, a method of controlling industrial heat cycles that could meaningfully reduce energy consumption in hospitals, manufacturing facilities, data centers, and any infrastructure that ran on continuous power loads. The technology was not the kind that photographed well or inspired investor enthusiasm at a cocktail party. It was engineering in the oldest sense of the word, the kind that requires years of productive failure before a single working prototype, and I had been failing productively for a very long time. Natalie had watched those years pass without visible financial returns, and somewhere in the middle of them, her patience became resentment, and then her resentment became something quieter and more permanent that I did not have a word for until much later. The woman who had asked about my sketches became a woman who stopped walking into the room where I kept them. By the time she joined Caspian Urban Partners as their director of brand relations, she had not asked about Kestrel Axis in over a year. Caspian was run by Bryce Ellery, who had built the company from a mid-sized regional real estate consultancy into one of the more aggressive urban development firms in the Southeast. He was the kind of man who wore his watch the way other men wear credentials, who filled quiet rooms with his voice, because he had learned somewhere along the way that volume is routinely mistaken for authority. Natalie worked for him for nearly 2 years before I began to understand what the shape of that relationship actually was. By the time I was certain, I had already decided that certainty without proof was a dangerous place to act from, so I said nothing and kept working. I did not know the full extent of the affair. I want to be clear about that because what happened later could suggest that I had been watching closely and preparing carefully, moving pieces into position the way someone with foresight and strategy does. I was not doing any of that. I was in my research space running thermal simulations and reviewing acquisition term sheets in encrypted email chains, and I had trusted the life outside those walls to hold itself together long enough for me to finish what I had started. The one person outside of my own head who understood the full picture was Evelyn March. Evelyn had been my attorney since the years when Kestrel Axis was nothing more than a series of patent applications and a business registration document that listed my garage as the company's official address. She was precise in the way that people become precise when they have spent most of their careers being underestimated, deliberate, thorough, and constitutionally unwilling to leave anything unverified. She had not agreed to represent me because she expected immediate profit. She had read the technical briefs I sent her and concluded that the underlying technology was legitimate and the applications were broad enough to matter. That assessment was enough for her to commit, and she had not wavered from it in the years that followed. By the morning of the gala, she was the only person in the world who knew both what Kestrel Axis was worth and what the acquisition confirmation would mean for me personally. As part of the confidentiality framework governing the acquisition, Evelyn also held remote access credentials to the security system I had installed in my home office 18 months earlier, a precaution we had put in place specifically to log and protect sensitive documents under the terms of our disclosure agreements. The confirmation arrived at 6:47 in the morning, transmitted through the acquiring corporation's secured legal platform. 14 months of negotiation conducted under a confidentiality agreement strict enough that even oblique references to the deal had to be cleared through Evelyn first. I had not been able to tell Natalie. I had not been able to tell anyone in my personal life, not because I did not want to, but because the terms of the agreement left no room for it, and breaking confidentiality at that stage would have voided provisions that protected a portion of the valuation. The confirmation that came through that morning was the last locked door opening. After taxes, after the structured investment commitments, I had already incorporated into the deal terms my personal stake in Kestrel Axis Technologies was worth $4.8 billion. I read the message 3 times at the kitchen table. Then I put the phone face down on the wood and got dressed. I chose my father's shirt because it was the day I had been waiting to wear it again, the day the thing I had built finally worked the way I always said it would. I had been intending to tell Natalie that evening, not at the gala itself, but in the margins of it before or after somewhere without an audience. I had told myself the news might help us. We had been moving through the same apartment like 2 people sharing a lease out of habit rather than intention, and I had constructed a quiet hope that once the uncertainty lifted, once she could see what the years of silence had been building towards something between us might recover. That hope was still intact when I got into the car with her. I understand now how much I wanted it to be true and how much work I had done to maintain the conditions necessary for believing it. Natalie had invited me to the gala 4 days earlier, framing it as a chance for us to appear somewhere together, to speak honestly, to decide seriously about what remained of our marriage. I accepted what she offered as what it appeared to be because I wanted it to be that. What I did not know then was that she had heard something through her professional network, not specifics, not enough to identify Kestrel Axis by name, but enough. A technology company in the region operating quietly, about to be acquired at a number significant enough that people with financial exposure were paying attention. She was not certain it was my company, but the possibility that it might be that I might suddenly have assets she had no claim to was enough to move her. She needed my signature on divorce papers before any connection between me and a transaction of that scale became a matter of public record. The gala was the environment she chose, a room where Bryce had standing, where she had allies, where I would be visibly out of place, and therefore easy to pressure. She asked me to wear my father's shirt because she knew what Bryce would do with it. The Lucent assembly sat along the river's edge, built entirely from glass and structural steel, the kind of architecture that reflects light back at you in ways designed to feel like abundance. 400 guests filled the main hall when we arrived, developers and investors and city officials and journalists, all the participants in civic ambition dressed up and circling each other with drinks in hand. Natalie moved through the room with a fluency I had not seen her use at home in years. She greeted people by name, leaned into conversations, and touched Bryce's arm when she found him in the crowd in a way that transmitted information without requiring any words. She did not introduce me as her husband. When I briefly joined a nearby exchange, she described me to the group as an old friend going through a difficult period, a phrase calibrated to position me as someone peripheral to her real life, someone whose presence required a polite explanation. I heard her say it twice before I recognized that the difficult period she was describing was our marriage, and that in the narrative she had constructed for this room, I was not a guest. I was an illustration. Bryce found me eventually. He assessed me in the way men like him assess things fast without sentiment, according to a scale he had already decided on before the evaluation began. He asked about my work with the tone of someone who has already determined that the answer will not interest him. And when I told him I worked in thermal engineering, he let the words sit in the air between us for a moment before moving past them entirely. He asked whether it was difficult to stand in a room like this one with all these people building things that mattered when my own contribution to the evening was being Natalie's +1. He was not looking for an answer. He was letting the people nearby hear the question. I turned to leave. I had no interest in what he was constructing, and I understood clearly that engaging with it on his terms would cost me more than walking away. But Bryce moved to close the social exit the way men with practice do not by physically blocking the path, but by raising his voice slightly and drawing in the executives nearby as though inviting them to something worth watching. I was the thing worth watching. Natalie appeared at his side. She faced the group rather than me when she spoke, and she said she wanted to explain plainly why she could no longer picture herself building a future alongside someone who had spent the better part of a decade standing still. The room drew in around the words the way rooms do when something unscripted and genuinely unpleasant enters the space. A tightening, a collective stillness. People adjusting their grip on their glasses without knowing why. She reached forward and took hold of my collar with both hands, and she pulled. The shirt split along the front seam. The buttons left the fabric and hit the marble floor in a scattered small percussion that seemed wildly inadequate for what was actually happening. Laughter came from somewhere to my left, not loud, but present, the kind that surfaces when people are uncertain whether what they have just witnessed was intended as comedy, and whether laughing makes them complicit. Natalie stepped back toward Bryce, and he settled his arm across her shoulders in the proprietary way of a man who wants a room to register that he has won something. She said the shirt was a perfect summary of 8 years. She said it was old and worn out and had no place among people who were actually going somewhere. She delivered it without raising her voice, which made it land differently than shouting would have. There was something in the steadiness of it, the practiced calm that told me she had arrived at this moment without hesitation. I crouched and picked up one of the buttons from the floor. It was small and white and had been on that shirt since my father bought it, and I held it in my palm and looked at it for a moment before straightening. Around me, the laughter had already dissolved back into murmuring, and people were redistributing themselves the way crowds do after watching something they are not sure they should have witnessed. I looked at Bryce. I looked at Natalie. I looked at the 400 people in that room who had all said nothing. I could have spoken. What I knew in that moment would have rearranged every assumption anyone in the hall had made about who I was. The confirmation had been on my phone since before 7 in the morning, but I held the button and said nothing. Not because I was performing patience and not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to know something specific. I wanted to know whether a single person in that room would choose to say something on behalf of a man they believed had nothing to offer them in return. Not one person moved. The security guard who approached me was younger than I expected, early 20s, with the careful expression of someone doing a job he had not yet decided how he felt about. He did not touch me. He positioned himself close enough to communicate intent and waited to see whether I would make the situation easier for both of us by walking voluntarily. I almost did. The cleaner option in that moment would have been to pocket the button, cross the hall, and let the night close behind me without further damage to anyone's evening. But Natalie had already followed me 2 steps, and she was holding something that changed the calculation entirely. It was a folder, the kind that looks unremarkable until you notice how carefully it has been prepared. She held it out to me with the flat confidence of a person who has rehearsed the gesture and decided it communicates authority. Inside were divorce documents, not a draft, not a preliminary filing, but a complete and notarized set of terms that had clearly been prepared over a period of time by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The asset division clauses were specific in ways that went beyond the obvious. There was language in the property section that referenced any financial interests arising from ongoing business ventures, and the phrase had been constructed carefully enough that it could apply to a transaction that had not yet been made public. Natalie was not certain the deal existed, but she had written the documents as though she suspected it might. She told me in front of Bryce and the executives who had rearranged themselves into an audience that she wanted my signature before the night was over. The marriage was finished regardless, she said. The only question was whether I intended to be reasonable about it. The tone she used was the tone of someone explaining something simple to someone slow. And I understood that the tone was part of the performance, that she needed the room to see me as the obstacle rather than as the person being maneuvered. Bryce stepped forward, then smoothing his jacket with both hands, and offered me what he described as a practical arrangement. He said he was willing to write me a personal check for an amount that would cover my immediate expenses provided I signed the papers that evening and removed myself from Natalie's life in any meaningful sense. He called it a settlement for someone who no longer had anything to contribute to the table. He used the phrase with the ease of a man who has delivered similar lines before and found them effective. I looked at him for a moment, at the watch, at the jacket, at the way he occupied the center of a room, as though gravity had been specifically calibrated to support his position there, and I handed the folder back to Natalie without opening it. Bryce caught the security guard's eye across the room and tipped his chin toward the door. The message was clear. Several people near us were still filming on their phones. I noticed this the way you notice ambient sound, not alarming, simply present, something to be aware of, and then filed away. No one intervened. Bryce was the leading candidate for the waterfront development contract, and in rooms where money determines alignment, no one steps between a man and the leverage he appears to hold. The guard touched my elbow lightly, and I moved with him toward the corridor because I had already decided I would not give the room a scene it could use against me later. My phone vibrated in my jacket pocket before we reached the service corridor. The message was from Evelyn, and it was 4 sentences. She said the announcement timeline had been moved forward by the acquiring corporation's communications team. She said the public disclosure of the Kestrel Axis transaction would take place that evening. She said the founder's name was legally required to appear in the presentation. And she said the venue for the announcement was the Lucent Assembly. I read the message twice. The guard had stopped walking because I had stopped walking, and I turned back toward the main hall before he could recalibrate his instructions. What happened next was not something I orchestrated. I want to be accurate about this because the version of events that circulated afterward suggested a level of planning I did not have. I had not known the announcement would happen that evening. I had not chosen the Lucent Assembly as the venue. The acquiring corporation's communications team had selected it months earlier because of its capacity and its association with the Ravenport infrastructure projects, and the timeline had been moved forward for reasons entirely internal to their organization. I was not the architect of what followed. I was simply a man who stopped walking when the information in his phone made stopping the only sensible response. Estelle Granger stepped onto the main stage at 9:14. She was a precise and unhurried woman who chaired the Ravenport Revitalization Authority, with the manner of someone who had learned long ago that the room will always quiet down if you wait long enough for it. She waited. The hall settled. She thanked the guests for the evening's attendance and told them that before the formal program concluded, she had been asked to facilitate a presentation that the authority considered foundational to the next phase of the waterfront project. Bryce was standing 20 feet to my left when she said this. I watched him straighten almost imperceptibly, the posture adjustment of a man who believes he is about to receive something he has been waiting for. Estelle announced that the Ravenport Revitalization Project had received a private investment commitment of $300 million from the founder of Kestrel Axis Technologies. She said this commitment would serve as the primary condition for selecting the management firm that would oversee the $2.3 billion waterfront development. The room shifted. Not loudly, but perceptibly, the particular atmospheric change that happens when money of that scale enters a conversation and people begin quietly reassessing their positions relative to it. The presentation film began on the large screen behind the stage. It ran for approximately 4 minutes. It covered the technology, the patent portfolio, the acquisition terms, and the projected impact across the industrial infrastructure sectors where the system had already been piloted. The numbers appeared on screen in sequence: company valuation, acquisition price, the retained founder's stake, and the room grew progressively quieter as each figure replaced the one before it. Then the film moved to its final segment, which introduced the company's founding engineer. My photograph appeared on the screen. It was not a flattering photograph. Evelyn had sourced it from a technical conference I had attended 3 years earlier, and I was wearing an expression that suggested I had been asked to smile and had done my best with limited enthusiasm. But it was recognizably me, the same face, the same build, the same man who was standing at the edge of that hall with a torn shirt and a button still in his palm. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it. 400 people processing a single piece of information that required them to simultaneously revise everything they had witnessed over the previous 40 minutes. Estelle Granger said my name. She invited me to join her on the stage as the founder of Kestrel Axis Technologies, as the transaction's majority stakeholder, and as the primary private investor in the Ravenport Revitalization Project. I walked to the stage. I did not hurry. When I reached the front, I closed my fingers around the button still in my palm and looked out at the room. I asked without heat and without theater, why not one person in the hall had said anything when they believed I was simply a man with nothing to offer them. No one answered. The question stayed in the air exactly as long as it needed to. Bryce's expression from where I stood was the expression of a man whose internal architecture is restructuring itself faster than his face can conceal. He had come to the evening holding what he believed was every significant piece of leverage available. He understood now that one of those pieces had been wrong in a way that changed the shape of every other piece. Caspian Urban Partners needed the waterfront contract. The waterfront contract's future was now connected directly and legally to a decision I would make. Natalie reached me before Bryce did. She moved through the crowd quickly and positioned herself at my side with a fluency that was almost impressive given what had happened 15 minutes earlier. She said the shirt was a joke, that the whole thing had been staged for the room, a bit of performance meant to add levity to an otherwise formal evening. She said it with a smile that she had calibrated for the people nearby rather than for me, and she reached for my arm in the way a person reaches for something they have decided to reclaim possession of. I asked her quietly why she had needed the room to think I was just an old friend going through a difficult period if the whole thing had been a joke between us. She did not answer that. Instead, she shifted her angle and told me that I had been dishonest, that I had hidden my financial situation from her throughout our marriage, that I had deliberately kept her in the dark about assets that belonged in part to both of us under the terms of our union, and that my silence had forced her into a position she would never have chosen otherwise. She said if she had known the truth, she would never have turned to Bryce. It was the most honest thing she said all evening, and it confirmed precisely what I had suspected about the conditions under which her feelings operated. Bryce's approach was less personal and more technical. He found me near the stage after Natalie had stepped away, and he told me that any decision to exclude Caspian Urban Partners from the Ravenport selection process would be interpreted as retaliatory interference in a competitive public procurement, and that he had legal counsel prepared to file accordingly. He delivered this with the tone of a man who believes the threat of litigation is a universally effective conversation ender. He was not prepared for what Evelyn had already found. She had been working the periphery of the room since the announcement, speaking to members of the project authority in the quiet, thorough way she did everything. She found me near the base of the stage and told me in a voice intended only for me that the documents Natalie had presented earlier were not the most significant problem. The more significant problem was that Natalie had been captured on the Home Office security system, removing files on 4 separate occasions over the preceding 8 months. The files she had taken were working drafts, internal memos, and preliminary planning documents related to the Kestrel Axis structure and the Ravenport investment framework. She had delivered copies of those documents to Bryce, and traces of the information had surfaced in Caspian's formal bid submission in ways that were specific enough to be traceable. Bryce had not simply been competing for the waterfront contract. He had been preparing his bid using information extracted from my private files by the person who shared my home. The affair was one thing. This was something else. What happened next arrived faster than I expected. Natalie, understanding that the room had shifted beyond the point where positioning could recover it, produced a document from her bag and presented it to two members of the project authority standing near the stage. She told them it was a signed transfer agreement dated 2 years prior, in which I had assigned her a 50% ownership stake in Kestrel Axis Technologies. The document had my signature on it. It had a notary seal from a firm whose principal had processed paperwork for Caspian Urban Partners the previous year. The authority members looked at the document with the careful attention of people who are aware that whatever they do next will be scrutinized. One of them suggested formally that the investment proceedings be suspended pending independent review of the ownership question. Estelle Granger, who had been listening from 6 feet away, said she would need to consult with the authority's legal team before the evening's commitments could be confirmed. The acquiring corporation's representative, who had been standing near the back of the hall since the presentation ended, sent a message to his home office within minutes of the document appearing. I received notification shortly after that. A portion of the transaction's payment structure had been placed under administrative hold pending resolution of the ownership dispute. The room that had gone quiet when my photograph appeared now carried a different quality of silence. The particular uncertainty of people watching a situation reverse itself in real time, not knowing yet which direction it would finally settle. Journalists who had been filing copy about the investment announcement were already revising their leads. Natalie stood near the authority members with the document in hand, and her expression had recovered something approaching composure. Bryce had positioned himself 4 feet behind her with his arms crossed, watching me with the focused attention of a man who believes he has just found the thread that unravels everything. I slipped the button into my jacket pocket. I thought about the morning my father gave me the shirt, the paper bag from the department store. The thing he said about spending money on what lasts rather than on what impresses. I thought about 6:47 in the morning and the message on my phone. I thought about Evelyn, who had stood beside this work for years before it had anything to show for itself, and who was standing beside it now in a room where it was being contested by people who had not known it existed until 40 minutes ago. The document in Natalie's hand looked real. The signature was precise. The notary seal was legitimate enough to require verification rather than dismissal. And the authority members were doing what institutional bodies do when presented with legal uncertainty in public. They were choosing caution over speed, and in doing so, they were giving the uncertainty room to grow into something that could take months to resolve. If it took months, the investment framework collapsed. If the framework collapsed, the waterfront project stalled. If the project stalled, everything I had negotiated those $300 million to accomplish the transparency requirements, the worker protections, the housing commitments for low-income families dissolved back into the city's general budget and disappeared. Natalie said she was willing to withdraw the document and allow the process to continue, provided I agreed to 3 conditions: split the Kestrel Axis proceeds equally, withdraw my investment from the Ravenport project, and allow the authority to select Caspian as the managing firm and make a public statement confirming that the evening's events had been a private misunderstanding between a husband and wife. She said this quietly, standing close enough that only I and the 2 authority members could hear her clearly. She had the practiced reasonableness of a person who has planned for the moment when the room stops being on their side and has prepared a position that makes refusal look like stubbornness rather than principle. I looked at her for a long moment. Outside, through the glass walls of the Lucent Assembly, the river was dark and flat and moving steadily south the way it always did, indifferent to the particular quality of human theater happening on its bank. The hold on the transaction was already in place. The document was already in the authority members' hands, and every reasonable incremental institutional process available to me was going to take time that the project could not survive intact. There was a version of that moment in which I gave her what she asked for. The numbers would have been painful, but survivable. The contract going to Bryce would have meant the housing commitments disappeared, but Ravenport would still get development, just the kind that benefits the people who design it rather than the people who live with it. And the statement she wanted the public misunderstanding between a husband and wife would have cost me something I could not precisely name, but understood clearly enough to know I was not willing to pay it. I told her no. The word no landed in the space between us without drama. Natalie's expression did not collapse. It recalibrated the way a person's face adjusts when the variable they had counted on behaves unexpectedly, and they need a moment to identify which secondary option becomes relevant. The two authority members standing nearby shifted their weight almost simultaneously, a small involuntary synchrony that told me they had been hoping for the easier outcome and were now preparing for the harder one. Bryce, from his position 4 feet behind Natalie, uncrossed his arms. He was already moving toward a different configuration of the situation, the particular focus of a man who keeps several contingency positions available and is selecting among them in real time. What neither of them knew, standing in that hall while the document sat in the authority member's hands, was that Evelyn had not spent the last 40 minutes circulating through the room making small talk. She found me within 2 minutes of my refusal and guided me 3 steps away from the cluster of people near the stage. She spoke at a volume calibrated only for me, and what she said was this. The signature on Natalie's document had been lifted from an insurance form Miles had signed 4 years earlier during a routine policy renewal. The document itself, the paper, the formatting, the notary seal had been produced at Caspian Urban Partners' office. Using the remote access credentials she held for my home security system, Evelyn had already pulled footage showing Natalie removing files on 4 separate occasions. That same evening, a preliminary analysis of the file's metadata conducted on Evelyn's laptop in the anteroom adjacent to the main hall was enough to establish that the document could not have been produced on the date it claimed. The creation timestamp embedded in the file placed it 3 days before the gala, and the printer's signature matched equipment registered to Caspian's office address through the city's business licensing records. It was not a full forensic determination, but it was specific enough to present. Evelyn brought the preliminary findings to Estelle Granger and the full authority panel in the anteroom. She did not present it as an allegation. She presented it as a sequence of verifiable facts accompanied by source documentation, and she invited the panel to draw their own conclusions. The panel's legal counsel reviewed the metadata analysis, cross-referenced the printer identification, and confirmed that the document's claimed date was inconsistent with its digital record. The notary whose seal appeared on the document was reached by phone within the hour. He confirmed he had no record of witnessing a transaction between Miles and Natalie Hawthorne at any point in the previous 5 years. The seal was his. The transaction was not. The document was fraudulent. The conclusion was not difficult to reach. What was more difficult, and what Evelyn had anticipated, was that institutional panels do not move quickly, even when the evidence is clear, because the cost of being wrong in one direction is always more visible to them than the cost of being slow. 2 members of the panel wanted the full analysis sent to an independent forensic examiner before any formal determination was made. Estelle Granger asked how long that would take, and the answer she received was between 4 and 6 weeks. Evelyn had anticipated this too. She had already made a second request to the panel's chair, not for a determination on the document, but for permission to present additional material directly relevant to the authority's assessment of all parties competing for the waterfront contract. Estelle granted the request. The additional material was a series of messages recovered from a shared cloud storage account that Natalie had maintained using a login credential created on a device registered to their shared home address. Evelyn had identified the account through the same security footage. On one occasion, the camera had captured enough of the screen to identify the storage platform and account name. The messages were between Natalie and Bryce, spanning approximately 11 months. Most of them were personal in nature and were not presented to the panel. The ones that were presented formed a specific and coherent record of a coordinated plan. The plan had a clear structure. Bryce had identified through the files Natalie brought him that the information was too specific to be coincidental. The structure of the investment framework, the preliminary allocation model for the Ravenport commitment, the waterfront project's regulatory requirements, as Miles had analyzed them. He had used that information to build Caspian's formal bid, incorporating Miles's own analysis as the foundation for his proposed approach. One message sent by Bryce to Natalie 6 weeks before the gala was specific enough that Evelyn read it aloud to the panel in full. In it, Bryce outlined what he wanted the evening at the Lucent Assembly to accomplish. He had assessed Miles's temperament as someone who would not tolerate public humiliation passively, and he had concluded that if Miles could be provoked into a confrontation in front of 400 witnesses, the resulting footage would be usable to challenge his fitness to manage assets or oversee a project of the waterfront's scale. He had told Natalie exactly what he needed from her. The shirt had been her idea. She knew Bryce's sense of humor well enough to know that the visual would land, but the objective had been his from the beginning. Estelle Granger read the message herself after Evelyn finished. She read it a second time. Then she looked at the panel around her and said with the unhurried precision that characterized everything she did that she believed the evening's proceedings could now continue. The panel's determination came within the hour. The fraudulent document was formally rejected and removed from the proceedings. The administrative hold on the transaction's payment structure was lifted. The Kestrel Axis acquisition was confirmed as legally unencumbered. Caspian Urban Partners was disqualified from the Ravenport revitalization project on the grounds of bid fraud, and the disqualification was entered into the public procurement record in terms specific enough that it would follow the firm into every subsequent government tender it attempted. Bryce's position within Caspian was suspended by the company's board of directors pending an internal review. A referral was made to the State Attorney General's office regarding the fabricated document and the notary who had allowed his seal to be misused. I was standing near the glass wall that faced the river when Estelle found me to confirm the decision. Through the wall, the water was moving the way rivers move, not hurrying, not halting, carrying itself forward without requiring the moment to mean anything. She shook my hand and said the $300 million commitment to the project was the most significant private investment the authority had received in its history, and that she looked forward to the work. I thanked her, and meant it plainly, without the particular inflection people use when they are performing gratitude for an audience. Natalie found me before I left the building. She had been standing near the main entrance for some time. I had seen her from across the hall, not approaching, not leaving, occupying the specific geographic uncertainty of a person who has not yet decided whether to stay or go. When she walked toward me, she had composed herself into a version of her face that I recognized from the early years of our marriage, the version that was open and a little vulnerable, that communicated an appeal to something shared and private between us. She said that she had lost herself. She said the world Bryce had introduced her to had moved faster than she knew how to evaluate, and that she had made decisions from inside a kind of momentum she could not fully account for now that it had stopped. She said she still loved me. She said it quietly in the tone of someone who has decided that sincerity is the only remaining currency available to them. I asked her one question. I asked whether if the screen in that hall had never shown my photograph, if the announcement had never happened, if I had remained in her understanding the man she had described to the room as an old friend, going through a difficult period, she would have come to find me afterward and said any part of what she was saying now. She looked at me for a long moment. Outside, someone was calling for a car. A group of guests near the door were collecting their coats. The night was moving toward its ordinary conclusion for everyone else in the building, the gradual dispersal of people back into their separate lives. Natalie did not answer my question. What she did instead was look at the floor, and that was the answer. The divorce proceedings were filed the following month. I did not pursue a settlement designed to leave her without resources. She was going to face legal consequences from the Attorney General's referral, and those consequences were going to cost her professionally and financially in ways that were already becoming clear. My attorneys structured the division of shared assets according to what each of us had actually contributed to the marriage, which in practice meant Natalie received a portion of the household savings and nothing connected to Kestrel Axis, because she had contributed nothing to Kestrel Axis. The courts would determine the rest. I did not attempt to influence the outcome beyond presenting accurate documentation of what had existed and when. The law was capable of handling what remained without my assistance, and I was prepared to let it. Caspian Urban Partners was replaced in the Ravenport project by a consortium of local firms, 4 companies with clean procurement records and established histories of working in the city's underserved neighborhoods. The consortium's selection process was conducted under expanded transparency requirements that Evelyn helped draft requirements that would apply to every subsequent phase of the waterfront development. The $300 million commitment I had made to the project was transferred and structured with additional conditions: independent financial auditing, enforceable worker wage standards, and a mandated housing allocation that reserved a portion of every residential development in the project footprint for families in the lowest income brackets the city's planning office tracked. The conditions were not popular with every member of the authority. They were accepted because the money was conditional on them and the project could not proceed without the money. The first section of the Ravenport waterfront opened in the spring of the following year. It was a training center, a 2-story facility built on a remediated industrial site along the river's southern bank, designed to provide technical education in the skilled trades to young people from neighborhoods that the city's economic development had historically moved around rather than through. The opening ceremony was small by the standards of civic events, which was appropriate because the facility itself was built for a population that civic events rarely acknowledged. I wore my father's shirt. A seamstress who operated an alteration shop 4 blocks from my apartment had repaired it over the course of 2 weeks, working carefully along the torn seam and replacing the scattered buttons with ones that matched as closely as the original hardware could be matched. She had done exceptional work. The shirt looked from any distance essentially as it had looked before, but where the collar met the body of the shirt, there was a small ridge of reinforced stitching visible only if you looked for it that marked the place where the fabric had been pulled apart and then brought back together. I had asked her to leave it. She had offered twice to press the seam flat enough that it would disappear entirely. I told her I wanted it to stay. Standing at the front of that room, looking at the faces of the young people who would use the training center, I thought about what the evening at the Lucent Assembly had actually cost and actually given. The cost was not the marriage which had been ending slowly for years before the gala made it official. The cost was not the public humiliation which had been unpleasant, and then in retrospect clarifying. The cost was something more specific, the brief period in that hall when I had genuinely believed I might lose the ability to use what I had built for the purpose I had built it for. What the evening had given was harder to name with the same precision. It had shown me with a clarity I could not have manufactured through reasoning alone exactly who the people around me were when they believed the power in a room was not mine. In my remarks at the opening, I said that becoming wealthy had not told me anything new about who I was. The night someone had tried to take everything I had built when the people in the room believed I had nothing had told me, something I could not have learned any other way. Not about myself, but about what it means to be in a room and choose to do nothing. I said that the building we were standing in existed because enough people had decided that doing nothing was not the answer they wanted to give, and that the people who would train here deserved to be in a field built by people who had made the same decision. After the remarks, I walked outside to the river. The day was cool and the water moved the way it always had, steadily without urgency, indifferent to whoever stood on its bank. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the button I had kept since the night of the gala. I held it in my palm for a moment, the same way I had held it on that marble floor, while 400 people said nothing. Then I closed my fingers around it, put it back in my pocket and walked inside. There was still work to do. The day was not finished, and neither was I. Miles didn't walk out of that night with $4.8 billion and call it a win. He walked out knowing exactly who the people around him were, and he chose to build something anyway. That's the kind of story worth telling. If it stayed with you, subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you the stories of people who stayed quiet when it mattered, stayed honest when it was hard, and let the truth do the work that anger never could. We'll see you in the next one.